Welcome to Trinity Church, Reading Through the Bible in a Year podcast. I'm Pastor Matt, and today I have with me Pastor Mike. Welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you.
Do you want to remind everyone what this podcast is all about and what our hope is for those that are listening?
Yeah, so this is a part of our initiative, Alive and Active, which is our year in the Bible reading, that we believe that the Word of God is alive and active in our lives, and as we dive into it on a daily basis, it helps further our faith and continue to help us grow closer to God and to one another. And we believe that the Bible is the inspired Word of God, that this is the way that God chooses to speak through us besides prayer and through other people, but especially through Scripture. And despite the fact that the Bible is many books with many different authors and voices, we believe that it contains one story, all that leads to Jesus, which is really exciting. And so as we are here and you're reading with us, we are helping unpack the ways in which this connects, and it is all part of one story leading to Jesus.
Yeah, and hopefully as you're reading and as we're talking, you're hearing us connect those dots to Jesus, and we'd love to hear from you guys as you connect those dots as well, where you're seeing Jesus show up in odd places like the really random Old Testament passages at times. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
And so congratulations on finishing Deuteronomy, 5 books down, and next week we are entering the book of Joshua, which gets to be a lot more narrative and a little bit more fast-paced. So congratulations for making your way through. And announcing Trinity Cafe winner, Jessica Schultz. So thank you for being a regular watcher and contributor, and thank you for posing your question. Last week you asked about the half-tribe of Manasseh, and what's up with that? And so Manasseh, the tribe of Manasseh is considered a half-tribe because he is one of the sons of Joseph. So the 12 tribes of Israel are the 12 sons of Jacob, but Manasseh and his brother Ephraim are the sons of Joseph, one of those 12 sons. And so they are kind of the split inheritance of Joseph's line. So
that's the quick version.
That is the quick version. So thanks for asking the good questions.
The non-correct answer is that as we were talking as a staff, is that Joseph just doesn't sound like an old enough name to be a tribal name. So we had to let's go Ephraim and Manasseh. So. All right, Pastor Mike, let's do some Q&A before we jump in. Tell us about your family growing up, parents, siblings.
So my parents are Tim and Mary Beth. They were awesome. We grew up in Minnesota. And then I have a younger sister, Kelly, who currently is residing out in California. And she is a professional glassblower and CrossFit coach. So she's kind of a big deal. She's pretty cool. So we had a great family experience growing up. And some of our best moments is my parents owned a cabin in western Wisconsin, and so we spent a lot of time out on the lake, and we would water ski, and we would pontoon, and I loved fishing. 4th of July, we'd deck out the pontoon, and so those were a lot of kind of our favorite moments. Tubing behind a speedboat was always great, so yeah. So
favorite family tradition growing up?
Favorite family tradition growing up? I don't know. This is a hard thing to answer because I feel like all of our family traditions feel so normal that I don't know what is a tradition and what's not a tradition, right? So, there's nothing kind of wild and crazy in terms of our traditions. But
what about favorite vacation growing up? Was it the lake, or did you have a different one?
Oh, I have a fun, really quick story. My family and I got to go out to Hawaii one time, which was amazing, and I got to learn how to surf. We were on the island of Maui, and the very first day that we were out there, we went to the beach, and my mom lost the keys to the rental car at the beach the first day that we were out there. And as crazy as it was, we actually met a family who was from our same town in Minnesota that was at that same beach at the same time. And I only tell that part of the story because the dad was a psychologist and wrote an article about how our family very like deftly navigated the conflict and didn't get super mad at each other and weren't like yelling and screaming. Like we were just like, hey, we have a problem. Let's work together as a family to try to solve it. Did we solve it? No, that key was lost. But we had a great vacation anyway.
The time you showed up in a psychological review of some sort.
Indeed.
All right. Well, let's dive into Deuteronomy, and we'll finish this book out today. So now in our first chapter today, chapter 13, we see Moses talks about dealing with false prophets and even the people who might lead others astray. So that's not just the prophets or false prophets, but just anybody who might pull God's people away and follow other idols. So he's warning these Israelites that if anyone, even family members, tries to lure them into idolatry, they should be completely rejected. And it's pretty harsh, some of the language in this, but he says that these people should actually be put to death. So, well, what are we supposed to do with that? And what is the key thing within this chapter 13 it's talking about?
Yeah, this is a really difficult passage to swallow because it is such a different framework than what we are used to. Yeah. We know for those of you that have been really keeping up, you know that the Israelites don't need any help falling into idolatry, that they are really good at that all by themselves. And so having false prophets that are coming in, interceding, and leading the Israelites astray is something that they are especially susceptible to. And so God gives very strict limits on what is kind of allowable and is very concerned with idolatry and people being led astray. Because as we talked about this past week in worship, some of that can carry on from generation to generation to the third and fourth and fifth generations. And so being able to cut that off right away when it starts to appear is really important for the faithfulness of the entire tribe of Israel, that it doesn't catch root and become a big problem, which, spoiler alert, it will happen.
Yeah. In many ways, what most of this section that we're reading in Deuteronomy is prophetic, because Moses is telling them exactly the pitfalls they'll fall into even though you're entering into the promised land, you're coming and grasping this promise that God has given you from generations upon generations ago, and yet even in the midst of this grasping of the promise and it coming to fulfillment, you are still you, and you still do the same things. And so in this, he's literally quite literally saying, hey, you have a tendency to fall into idolatry, and you're going to do that in the promised land, and it's going to be a cyclical thing that keeps coming up, which we definitely get into in the book of Judges, is this constant cycle of sin. So let's jump to chapter 14. Moses talks about clean and unclean foods, and he's giving the Israelites some more detailed laws here, which we ran into in previous books, dietary laws that were meant to set them apart from other nations. But it wasn't just about health. It was also about identity, making them unique and different than those around them. Like when they followed these laws, they were signaling to the world that they were a people chosen by God. And this is where, honestly, I'm very thankful to be on the New Testament side of this conversation. Hebrew national hot dogs are okay, but living a kosher life seems difficult, and I really like bacon a lot.
I think we've established this. I made bacon for my kids this morning, so I'm very happy for the interaction between Peter and Cornelius in the book of Acts later, that kind of God opens it up and says, like, there's a lot more foods that are clean.
The blanket of meat.
Yeah. Saying that this is no longer what is going to define your holiness as a people, is your dietary laws. Which is
very big shift in the New Testament that happens.
It's a huge shift.
Yeah.
And the early Jewish followers of Jesus really struggled with this and wrestled with it, because this is what made them distinct from other nations and gave them a national identity. That it was almost kind of like a spiritual discipline of, like, if you could deny yourself these other foods that other cultures were eating, then you could deny worshiping their gods. And so it was a way of staying in sync with God's way of living in every aspect of life. Of like, if you're following the small things, then it helps you follow the bigger things, even down to like what they were eating. And so it's really fascinating how the Israelites were living out their identity in practical ways every day. And that helped remind them of the spiritual things until those practical things ended up becoming the focus and actually obscuring their spiritual practices and overtaking their identity of, I won't eat pork, but maybe I will get greedy and love money a little bit too much.
Yeah, which is what we see, like entering into Easter, like this is what we see played out in the Sadducees and Pharisees to such a high degree of that dictating law to the minute detail. But yeah, so for healthy practices, yes, but also identity issue thing within this as well. So, okay, chapter 15. This is an interesting one. Chapter 15 is the year of Jubilee. Speaking of living out this identity, the year of Jubilee is interesting in that it's a huge thing that it talks about, meaning that every 7 years debts were forgiven and slaves were set free. And it was meant to reset like a social economic balance in Israel, to remind the people of God's grace in the midst of it.
And what it says over and over again is, remember that you were slaves in Israel and I set you free. Therefore, remember to do this for others. And so, the year of Jubilee is just one of those like really radical concepts that really would have set Israel apart from any other society. And yet what's really sad is that there is no historical evidence of this being practiced on a large scale, which speaks to the conditions of our heart, that this is a rule that this is the second time in the first 5 books of the Bible that we hear about the year of Jubilee. And it's such a big part of getting at God's heart for justice and mercy. And yet the people just struggle with following it.
And as you and I were talking, we were talking about, like, I would think that if this was to happen, like they were to declare, hey, we're doing a year of Jubilee, the natural tendency is that, hey, I'm not going to give out loans then for this next year because I don't want to have to forgive them in 6 months or a year. And it addresses it, right?
Yeah, the author of Deuteronomy addresses it in chapter 15 at the very end and is like, look, don't be stingy with your loans in the last year in anticipation of the year of Jubilee, that I know in your hardness of hearts, you'll not want to loan out money in year 6 because then all of a sudden, like, you don't have a lot of time to be repaid on your loan before it gets forgiven. And God is basically saying through this passage, like, look, it's not about the money, it's about the heart. And that we should be generous even when it feels like a bad deal for us.
So the other interesting thing with the year of Jubilee is that Jesus proclaimed a year of Jubilee. And that's like our one story that leads to Jesus. Big moment maybe in this whole section is Jesus declaring he is the Jubilee in essence.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people immediately go to a spiritual year of Jubilee, of saying that Jesus, the one who forgives sins, is bringing on a year of Jubilee in which people are no longer captive to sin. And also, we cannot ignore the fact that the concept of Jubilee was economic and financial. And so as he declares a year of Jubilee for him coming, that the people who would have heard that at the time would have thought in economic terms when they heard him say that, and would not have immediately interpreted that as spiritual. That we're really good at, human beings, of like saying, oh, if this is going to negatively affect me financially, then it's just a metaphor for spiritual stuff.
And in the context also, we're hearing, like you were just talking a little bit ago about this understanding of being set free as slaves, like that we just walked through in Exodus, but he's also declaring the freedom of us from sin and the slavery we have to sin in the midst of this as well. And so there's this dynamic happening, and when he declares it, it is very loaded in terms of what he's all declaring in this Jubilee. So Let's go, jump to chapter 18. We see a warning about as you enter this land, and this is kind of this prophetic thing, the promised land, that you need to be careful not to fall into the ways of the other nations and the people around you. And we see this warning earlier in the book as well, where he warns specifically against evil practices of these nations, divination, fortune-telling, sorcery, necromancer. We know Lord of the Rings reference, right? Everybody knows the Lord of the Rings reference.
Or D&D reference.
Come on, Chris. We need to put a pressure campaign on Chris Randall, to read Lord of the Rings.
Has he not read Lord of the Rings?
Or at least watch the movies.
I was going to say.
He's got a couple weeks of sitting around holding baby coming up soon. So 24 hours of Hobbit and Lord of the Rings extended versions.
That's right, because in the Hobbit, Sauron is referenced as the necromancer and not really named See, anyway.
Look at the wisdom you're getting today, Chris. See? So a little peer pressure out there for Chris. When you see him, talk to him about Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, and so in chapter 18, where Moses is talking about the role of prophets and also of false prophets, we really have to remember that there are a ton of different ways in which God knows that the people of Israel will be plagued by false prophets and will be enticed to follow idolatry, try to delve into the mystic arts in ways in which they're worshiping other gods, and God is just trying to set strict barriers and boundaries for his people, knowing that they're honestly not going to follow them. That it talks about erecting Asherah poles, and we first see that even all the way back in Genesis, and the Israelites are dealing with worship of Asherah all the way through the line of kings, and it becomes a problem.
A declaration almost of whether this king was good or bad based off of what they did with the Asherah poles.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And one of the warnings that comes up in the midst of this is, hey, these nations will sacrifice their children, their sons and daughters, to be burned as a sacrifice in the fire, and you will fall into this as well. Yeah. And that warning is a sharp warning of this is what these nations are involved in, and stay away from it.
Yep. So
let's chapter 18.
Yeah, so let's talk about chapters 19 and 20, where Moses gives laws about cities of refuge and how to handle warfare. It's really interesting that even all the way back in Moses' time, they are making a distinction between murder and manslaughter.
Yeah.
And creating these cities of refuge that if you do something that's going to anger your neighbor, but is not necessarily, you didn't intend to do that, that God is creating grace and mercy and forgiveness and second chances for people who destroy property or even kill somebody. And they don't, God doesn't want to see those people killed by their neighbors, and is creating these cities of refuge.
Yeah.
And yet, to not excuse the guilty, which we talked about this past week in worship, for those who in their heart is so corrupted that they have committed murder intentionally.
Yeah.
So our first degree, second degree, third degree murder, the levels of premeditation, Israelites were thinking about that 3,000 and 4,000 years ago, which is crazy.
And this idea of justice sits in this understanding of punishment, but also within the context of how to protect and restore as well. And so that's chapter 19 and 20. Then we get to we're going to jump to chapter 27, 28. We get these blessings and curses that get delivered, and Moses lays out the consequences for obeying and disobeying God's commands. And the blessings are incredible: prosperity, health, victory, but the curses, severe: death, destruction, defeat to their enemies, exile, and it really drives home the importance of staying faithful to God's covenant in the midst of that. So,
and I mean, we think of curses, I think, a little bit differently than the Israelites would have, and how God's deploying it here. But basically, he's just warning them that there are going to be consequences to their actions. That it's an invitation to choose life, and a reminder that disobedience will have both divine and natural consequences when and those are what are meant by curses, and not necessarily some sort of like supernatural, like if you do this, then you're going to be cursed and have bad luck. But to say like, if you don't follow in obedience to God's commands, then you're going to bring hardship on yourself.
Yeah.
And that eventually like that disobedience will lead to death. And what's really kind of sad and sobering about the end of Deuteronomy is that not even Moses is completely free from the consequences of disobedience.
Yeah.
That at the end of Deuteronomy, we get Moses' farewell. There's a beautiful poem of Moses or song of Moses, followed by God leading him up Mount Nebo, which is in modern day Jordan. And then at the very end, chapter 34 describes Moses' death and his kind of final interaction with God, in which God allows him to see the promised land and say, look, this is where my promises are still coming true. You won't get to realize it, but Joshua and your descendants will.
Yeah. And he, in that chapter, he talks about this promise that was made to Abraham,
and
Isaac, and Jacob, which is a phrase that gets brought up so frequently. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And it is a reminder constantly of God's faithfulness in the midst of whatever is happening, that they can trust and rely on the Lord. So Moses has seen the promised land. He dies. They mourn for 30 days. And then it gives this kind of transition right at the end of 34 of Joshua taking the helm of leadership on.
Yeah. And so we'll get to read all about Joshua in a book that is aptly named Joshua. But one of the things that I wanted to highlight that we were talking about as staff is that Moses does not complain about not getting to see the promised land, which I think is an incredible statement of his obedience to God, even as God is giving him consequences for his disobedience, that Moses takes it standing up, and he doesn't complain bitterly of being like, God, you sent me on this huge mission that I never wanted to go on, to set the people free from Israel or from Egypt, to bring them to the promised land, and I've spent the last 40 plus years of my life dedicated to this cause, and I don't even get to see it through. And yet Moses seems at peace with it. Yeah. Which is crazy.
And then it records his death, and it's interesting when you think back through what we've read so far. He is on the precipice looking out over this promised land. He sees it for the first time 40 years before. He was basically on the doorstep, but he didn't go to see it. It says 12 spies went.
Did,
and unfortunately, within that 12 spies, 10 of them gave the bad report, which led them into 40 years of wandering, exile, and now puts them back on the doorstep. So,
right, a journey that could have taken 2 or 3 weeks ended up lasting 40 years, and it's really sad. But at the same time, I think that there is a certain amount of faithfulness that is displayed through Moses in continuing to carry on this tradition. And I think that one of the things that I take away from Moses' story, particularly as he is looking onto the promised land that he will never enter into himself, is a reminder that we as faithful followers of God, we carry on God's work, not necessarily knowing if we're going to see the fruit of it and get to enjoy it for ourselves. That in many ways, our call sometimes is setting up the next generation to experience God's blessings. And that is faithfulness, even when we don't get to realize it for ourselves.
It's interesting as you say that. I've talked with other ministry leaders at times around that very topic of, we don't always, in ministry, in student ministry, in pastoral ministry, and just ministry in general, we don't always get to see the fruit of our labor. And so one of the things that I've encouraged others that I've met with before is like, have something that you can see an end to. So like, I'll go work on a wood floor and I can see a finished product, and it just brings relief, because you're like, that part of life and faithfulness is that we're incomplete people, and being in ministry, we never get to see the full experience always of somebody's life and faithfulness either. We see them in the midst of struggle and life and faithfulness and disobedience as well. And so this is one of those things that it's interesting to note within Moses' life of that beauty of faithfully following. So, yeah. That's, I think, all we got. So
that's all we got.
Joshua next week. I am excited for Joshua because, for one, more narrative. And there's just a lot more story. There's we see the same cycles, though, that we saw previously lived out, and all these prophetic things that Moses talks about. Like, one of the things that we didn't mention is Moses warns them, hey, you're going to want to declare a king when you get to the promised land, and then they're going to take on too many wives, and they're going to take on too many animals, and they're going to be corrupt. And, like, he gives all these warnings that all happen. So it's a really interesting, we see this consistent cycle. So keep an eye out for that as we enter into Joshua, Judges, and beyond that. So any final words?
No, just thanks for joining us. Way to get through, I think, the most difficult part of Scripture, and to remain faithful to the task of growing and continuing to lean into these stories and these verses that you may not have ever studied or heard about in church before. And so, great job. We'll see you next week.